his bell rang again, as if some naughty little hobbit boy was trying to pull the handle off. "Someone at the door," he said, blinking. "Some 4, I should say, by the sound," said Philly. "Besides, I saw them coming along behind us in the distance." The poor little hobbit sat down in the hall and put his head in his hands and wondered what had happened, and what was going to happen, and whether they would all stay to supper. Then the bell rang again, louder than ever, and he had to run to the door. It was not 4 after all, it was 5. Another dwarf had come along while he was wandering in the hall. He had hardly turned the knob before they were all inside, bowing and saying, "At your service," one after the other. Dory, Norry, Orry, Owen, Gloin were their names, and very soon 2 purple hoods, a grey hood, a brown hood, and a white hood were hanging on the pegs, and off they marched with their broad hands stuck in their gold and silver belts to join the others. Already it had almost become a throng. Some called for ale, some for porter, one for coffee, and all of them called for cakes, so the hobbit was kept quite busy for a while. A big jug of coffee had just been set in the hearth, seed cakes were gone, and the dwarfs were starting on a round of buttered scones, when there came a loud knock. Not a ring, but a hard rat-tat on the hobbit's beautiful green door. Somebody was banging with a stick. Bilbo rushed along the passage, very angry and altogether bewildered and bewuthered. This was the most awkward Wednesday he ever remembered. He pulled open the door with a jerk, and they all fell in, one on top of the other. More dwarfs, 4 more, and there was Gandalf behind them, leaning on his staff and laughing. He had made quite a dent in the beautiful door. He had also, by the way, knocked out the secret mark that had been put there the morning before. "Carefully, carefully," he said. "It's not like you, Bilbo, to keep friends waiting on the mat and then open the door like a popgun. Let me introduce Bifur, Bofur, Bombur, and especially Thorin." "At your service," said Bifur, Bofur, and Bombur, standing in a row. Then they hung up 2 yellow hoods and a pale green one. Also hung up was the sky blue one with a long silver tassel. This last belonged to Thorin, an enormously important dwarf, in fact no other than the great Thorin Oakenshield himself, who was not at all pleased at falling flat on Bilbo's mat, with Bifur, Bofur and Bombur on top of him. For one thing, Bombur was immensely fat and heavy. Thorin indeed was very haughty, and said nothing about service, but poor Mr. Baggins said he was sorry so many times that at last he grunted, "Pray, don't mention it," and stopped frowning. "Now, we're all here," said Gandalf, looking at the row of 13 hoods, the best detachable party hoods, and his own hat hanging on the pegs. "Quite a merry gathering. I hope there's something left for the latecomers to eat and drink. What's that? Tea? No, thank you. A little red wine, I think, for me." "And for me," said Thorin. "And raspberry jam and apple tart," said Bifur. "And mince pies and cheese," said Bofur. "And pork pie and salad," said Bombur. "And more cakes and ale and coffee, if you don't mind," called the other dwarfs through the door. "Put on a few eggs, there's a good fellow," Gandalf called after Bilbo, as the hobbit stumped off into the pantry. "And just bring out the cold chicken and pickles." "Seems to know more about the inside of my larders as I do," said Mr. Baggins, who was feeling positively flummoxed, and was beginning to wonder whether a most wretched adventure had not come right into his house. By the time he had got all the bottles and dishes and knives and forks and glasses and plates and spoons and things piled up on big trays, he was getting very hot and red in the face, and annoyed. "Confusticate and be bother these dwarfs," he said aloud. "Why don't they come and lend a hand?" And lo and behold, there stood Balin and Dwalin at the door of the kitchen, and Killy and Philly behind them, and before you could say knife, they'd whisked the trays and a couple of small tables into the parlour and set out everything afresh. Gandalf sat at the head of the party with the 13 dwarfs all round, and Bilbo sat on a stool at the fireside, nibbling at a biscuit. His appetite was quite taken away by this stage, and trying to look as if this was all perfectly ordinary and not in the least an adventure in his own home. The dwarfs ate and talked, and time got on. At last they pushed their chairs back, and Bilbo made a move to collect the plates and glasses. "I suppose you'll all stay for supper," he said in his polite but unpressing tones. "Of course," said Thorin, "and after. We shan't get through this business till late, and we must have some music first. Now, to clear up." Thereupon the 12 dwarfs, not Thorin, he was too important, and stayed talking to Gandalf, jumped to their feet, and made tall piles of everything. Off they went, not waiting for trays, balancing columns of plates, each with a bottle on top, with one hand, while the hobbit ran after them, almost squeaking with fright. "Please be careful! Please don't trouble! I can manage!" But the dwarfs only started to sing.
Blunt the knives, bend the forks,
Smash the bottles and burn the corks.
check the glasses and crack the plates. That's what Bilbo Baggins hates. Cut the cloth, turn the hat, leave the rooms on the bedroom mat, pour the milk on the pantry floor. Splash the wine on every door, dump across the boiling bowl, count them up with a thumping bowl. When you're finished with them, send them down the hall to roll. That's what Bilbo Baggins hates.
And of course, they did none of these dreadful things, and everything was cleared and put away as quick as lightning, while the Hobbit was turning round and round in the middle of the kitchen trying to see what they were doing. Then they went back and found Thorin with his feet on the fender of the fire, smoking a pipe. He was blowing the most enormous smoke rings, and whenever he told one to go, it went up, anywhere, up the chimney, behind the clock on the mantelpiece. It was amazing. "Now, for some music," said Thorin. "Bring out the instruments." Killy and Philly rushed for their bags and brought back little fiddles. Dory, Nori and Ori brought flutes from somewhere inside their coats. Bombur produced a drum from the hall. Buffer and Bofer went out too and came back with clarinets that they had left among their walking sticks. Dwalin and Balin said, "Excuse me, I left mine in the porch." "Just bring mine in with you," said Thorin. They came back with viols as big as themselves and with Thorin's harp wrapped in a green cloth. It was a beautiful golden harp, and when Thorin struck it, the music began all at once, so sudden and sweet that Bilbo forgot everything else and was swept away into dark lands under strange moons far over the water and very far from his hobbit hole under the hill. The dark came into the room from the little window that opened into the side of the hill. The firelight flickered. It was April, and still they played on, while the shadow of Gandalf's beard wagged against the wall. The dark filled all the room, and the fire died down and the shadows were lost, and still they played on, singing of the deep places of their ancient homes, and this is a fragment of their song.
Far over the misty mountains cold, to dungeons deep and caverns old, we must away ere break of day to find our long forgotten gold. The pines were roaring on the height, the winds were moaning in the night. The fire was red, it flaming spread. The trees like torches blazed with light.
As they sang, the Hobbit felt the love of beautiful things made by hands and by cunning and by magic moving through him, a fierce and jealous love, the desire of the hearts of dwarves. Then something Tookish suddenly woke up inside him and wished to go and see the great mountains and hear the pine trees and the waterfalls and explore the caves, maybe wear a sword instead of a walking stick. He looked out the window. The stars were in the dark sky above the trees. He thought of the jewels of the dwarves shining in dark caverns. Suddenly, in the wood beyond the water, a flame leapt up, probably somebody lighting a bonfire, and he thought of plundering dragons settling on his quiet hill and kindling it all to flames. He shuddered, and very quickly he was plain Mr. Baggins of Bag End, Underhill again. He got up trembling. He had less than half a mind to fetch the lamp, and more than half a mind to pretend to, and go and hide behind the beer barrels in the cellar, and not come out again until the dwarfs had all gone away. Suddenly, he found that the music and the singing had stopped, and they were all looking at him with eyes shining in the dark. "Where are you going?" said Thorin, in a tone that seemed to show that he both guessed halves of the Hobbit's mind, the Took and the Baggins. What about a little light?" said Bilbo apologetically. "We like the dark," said all the dwarfs. "Dark, for dark business. There are many hours before dawn." "Of course," said Bilbo, and sat down in a hurry. He missed a stool and sat on the fender, knocking over the poker and shovel with a crash. "Hush!" said Gandalf. "Let Thorin speak." And this is how Thorin began. "Gandalf, dwarves, and Mr. Baggins, we are met together in the house of our friend and fellow conspirator, the most excellent and audacious hobbit. May the hair on his toes never fall out. All praise to his wine and ale." He paused for breath and for a polite remark from the hobbit, but the compliments were quite lost on poor Bilbo Baggins, who was wagging his mouth in protest at being called audacious, and worst of all, fellow conspirator, though no noise came out, he was so flummoxed. So Thorin went on. "We are met to discuss our plans, our ways, means, policies, and devices. We shall soon, before the break of day, start on a long journey, a journey from which some of us, perhaps all of us, except our friend and counsellor, Gandalf, may never return. It is a solemn moment. Our object is, I take it, well known to all of us. To the estimable Mr. Baggins, and perhaps to one or two of the younger dwarfs, Gilly and Philly I should be right in naming, the exact situation at the moment may require a little brief explanation." Thorin was about to go on, but Bilbo couldn't bear it any longer. At "may never return," he began to feel a shriek coming up inside him, and very soon it burst out, like the whistle of an engine coming out of a tunnel. All the dwarfs sprang up, knocking over the table. Gandalf struck a blue light on the end of his magic staff, and in the firework glare, the poor little hobbit could be seen kneeling on the hearthrug, shaking like a jelly that was melting. Then he fell flat on the floor and kept calling out, "Struck by lightning! Struck by lightning! Struck by lightning!" over and over again, so that all they could get out of him was that for a long time. They took him, laid him out of the way on the drawing-room sofa with a drink at his elbow, and went back to their dark business. "He's an excitable little fellow," said Gandalf. "He gets funny queer fits, but he's one of the best. He's one of the best. As fierce as a dragon in a pinch." If you've ever seen a dragon in a pinch, you'll realise that this was only poetical exaggeration applied to any hobbit, even to the old Took. In the meanwhile, Gandalf continued speaking, but Glóin interrupted. Well, will he do you think? It's all very well to Gandalf to talk about this hobbit being fierce, but one shriek like that at a moment of excitement would be enough to wake the dragon and all his relatives and kill the lot of us. I think it sounded more like fright than excitement. In fact, if it had not been for the sign on the door, I should have been sure we'd come to the wrong house. As soon as I clapped eyes on the poor little fellow bobbing and puffing on the mat, I had my doubts straight away. There's more of a grocer than a burglar about him. Just then, Mr. Baggins turned the handle and went in. The Took side had won over the Baggins. He suddenly felt he would go without bed and breakfast to be thought fierce. As for little fellow bobbing on the mat, it made him quite fierce. Many a time afterwards, the Baggins party regretted what he just did, and he said to himself, Bilbo, you were a fool. You walked right in and put your foot in it. Pardon me, he said. If I had overheard words that you were saying, I don't pretend to understand what you're talking about, or the reference to burglars, but I think I'm right in believing, this is what he called being on his dignity, that you think I'm no good. I'll show you. I have no signs on my door. It was painted a week ago, and I'm quite sure that you have come to the wrong house. As soon as I saw your funny faces on the doorstep, I had my doubts too, but treat it as the right one. Tell me what you want done, I'll try it. If you want me to walk from here to east of east and fight the wild weirworms in the last desert, I had a great-granduncle once. His name was the Bullroarer Took, and yes, that was a long time ago, said Glóin. I was talking about you, and I assure there is a mark on the door, the usual one in the trade, or used to be. You know, burglar wants a good job, plenty of excitement, reasonable reward. That's how it usually reads. You can say expert treasure hunter instead of burglar if you like. Some of them do, but it's all the same to us. Gandalf told us there was a man in these parts looking for a job at once, and that he had arranged for a meeting here, this Wednesday, tea time. Of course